What do you think some of the reasons were for this apostasy that kind of really did happen, before the boomers with the greatest generation? My suspicion is that, part of it just had to do with seeing such atrocities in the world and just thinking, how could there be a God? Do you think it's deeper than that? Do you think that that was one of the major factors, that they just didn't have a full orbed theology for dealing with sovereignty of God and suffering, or those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of factors. Number one is post-Enlightenment thinking certainly was coming to fruition, right? It had been around obviously for a while, but I think really coming to fruition, and you're seeing the long-term fruits of it start to come out of World War II. So I think that's a huge part of it. But I also think World War One, in particular, when you unpack what was going on in that war, you really had Western Christendom foolishly going to war with each other. So before we have, Mao and Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini and all the fascist communist dictators who take over the world. Before that, you have really cousins in England and Germany, Prussia, and then also in Russia going to war with each other. And you've got Christendom slaughtering each other on the battlefield for fundamentally stupid reasons. This is why in this time period, it's a cataclysmic shift, because it's really the undoing of the West that comes out of World War One. And I think that legitimately shook a lot of people's faith. This is one of the reasons it's usually one of the biggest critiques of postmillennialism that we find, right, is because of what happened in World War One and Two. People say, post-mill theology is dead. The dream of Christendom really came crashing down. So we would obviously disagree with that, but I think we do have to acknowledge the world in many ways came unglued during that time period. And so what we're living with today is really like, kind of the aftermath of World War II, what was established since then. You can see a lot of it even in, American politics and American dispensationalism with the eventual founding of the state of Israel. And then, I grew up with this in dispy churches where it's like, we're flying Israeli flags on our front porches and stuff like that. So I think that just shaped a lot of it. And I think, quite frankly, if you talk to a lot of the greatest generation, they didn't really have good bearings. You're like 50 to 60 years after the Civil War for a lot of those guys, which is kind of hard for us to fathom, right? That they also lived through that period. That was a very disruptive period. Calvinism was dying. This is one of the other arguments that I've made, is that patriarchy and Calvinism go together. And with the rise of Unitarianism in America in the 1800s, you really saw Calvinism and Puritanism waning. And those were the things that were holding society together, particularly the nuclear family.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, just from my personal, pastoral counseling, anytime there's an objection or a hesitancy or just a fear of wives submitting to husbands and
Mm,
patriarchy, I've always noticed that it goes hand in hand. It's usually the person who doesn't like Reformed theology.
yes.
Believe it or not everybody, in my church is a Calvinist. Most are, because I'm fairly outspoken in that regard. It's a systematic, way of theologically thinking that's going to influence everything that every text that I cover. Reformed theology is there, but there are individuals who aren't persuaded by Calvinistic doctrine, and often that's the same individual who struggles with patriarchy. And I think of what I believe it's Peter that he talks about, and you are her daughters, speaking of Sarah, who called her husband Abraham her lowercase l Lord, master, the head, her head. And he said, you're her daughters if you do likewise, if you follow in her example. But then he goes on and says, and do not fear anything that is frightening. And one of the things that I think gives us peace, whether we're a man or a woman, we all have someone, human authority placed by God in our lives that we have to submit to varying degrees according to the Word of God. And to know that there's a Lord of lords, right? Abraham was, when you think like, who are these lords that Jesus is Lord of, right? He's King of kings and Lord of lords. Well, he's King of earthly kings and he's King of earthly lords. And one example of an earthly lord is a husband. And to know, as a wife, that there's a Lord over this Lord who loves me and who is sovereign over this lesser Lord, my husband, and guiding him, that causes the fear associated with the commandment to submit to your husband to not be so daunting, that you don't have to fear that which is frightening. But if you don't believe that God's sovereign, um, then yeah, it's like, well, I know my husband. I don't, I know his flaws. I know his weaknesses. And so, at least if in no other way, I see a correlation there. Is there another correlation that you're referring to, Calvinism and patriarchy?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And then I think too, like you'll watch like, uh, Caddy Stanton and the other ladies who are pushing early wave feminism, which a lot of people mistakenly today are like, oh, first wave was fine. No, it really
Right.
wasn't. You look at their theology and their background. Those women were sincerely trying to replace male pastors, slowly, granted. But yeah, so they come on the scene, they're pushing feminism, and you can read their writing, and the thing that they hate is Calvinism,
Hmm.
because it's kind of like the reaction you would see people having to God's sovereignty, right? When people first come in introduced to that doctrine, it's like, oh yeah, but man's responsibility, God's sovereignty. They get really frustrated. You can see it in them, but it's the same thing when you're talking about patriarchy and you're talking about submission. Like, just look up in the Greek in Ephesians 5. What does submission actually mean? It means somebody's in charge and somebody isn't. It means hierarchy, a number of those things. But it's also interesting. I think the connection also would be that, you ask what has caused fatherlessness. Feminism. I mean, feminism has been a cancer in the bones of the nuclear family. And it's something that I think today in the church, especially, instead of addressing that and calling that out, what pastors have done is said, like, okay, let's do the Tim Keller. Let's try to make a way for them to
Right.
coexist,
Right. A
which
third way is.
fundamentally has been like, if you or I were to say, well, maybe I can just live with the cancer. Maybe it won't destroy me.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. How to live with cancer. Yeah. The third way, Keller approach has been, that in itself has been a plague on modern evangelicalism for quite a while. So the rise of feminism, and I think we could probably root, no fault divorce within the larger banner of
Yes.
feminism. And then you said that with feminism there was this simultaneous thing happening of like there's this aversion towards patriarchy, but also the turning away from classically reformed doctrine and an aversion towards Calvinism.